Hi folks, this unit's theme is on alien encounters, and so let's talk about what that entails and what that can mean in science fiction. Now, our texts from this unit are fairly contemporary. We have one from 1995, and then all the other two are post-2000. And so we are getting a modern conception of what this idea of alien represents. But the history of alien in science fiction is long and storied. So, the term alien, to refer to an extraterrestrial, did not actually exist in the science fiction vernacular until 1929. However, the concept of aliens, or the trope of aliens in science fiction, was sort of put to the forefront with H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, which was published in 1901. And this novel is about a very classic representation of the extraterrestrial alien in science fiction, which is the invasion, the battle between invading aliens and the planet of humans. And you see this, of course, in all sorts of other different iterations in science fiction as well. Now, when that story was published, it was related to a number of things that were going on at the time. 1901, turn of the century, we're in the Industrial Revolution. So very much the same time that E.M. Forster was writing with the machine stops. But this idea of technology, or what sort of isolation or alienation we will face from each other with a more technologically advanced world was on people's minds. This was also at the height of British imperialism. H.G. Wells was British, and during the era of British imperialism, there was, of course, a lot of colonization, but there was also a lot of anxiety about the status of that empire. Many people in Victorian England were starting to get worried that their sort of supremacy or exceptionalism was under threat. And many people were also, becoming increasingly more suspicious of the other that existed in these imperial colonies and in, other parts of the world because of what was happening sort of sociopolitically. They had also, during this period of time, just identified Mars. So the idea that there could be life on Mars was something on people's minds when H.G. Wells was writing. Now, in terms of the alien in science fiction throughout the canon, I think it's interesting to point out and be aware that the term alien, as I mentioned, did not exist for an extraterrestrial until 1929. Historically and etymologically, the term alien comes from the word for foreigner, or for outsider, or stranger. So the term alien in and of itself actually is a word that we use to refer to each other long before we ever used it to refer to things from outer space. So let's talk a little bit about this concept of the other that we have covered in robots and in, human versus the machine. The Frankenstein effect, or the idea that something we create will surpass us or become dominant over us, that is something that appears in a lot of science fiction and often becomes a symbolic representation or metaphor for the other in society. And aliens in a lot of ways work very similarly, in that they are often representative of the other. However, you want to think about the fundamental difference between what like a robot might be akin to and what an alien would be. So robots represent the other that we create. They are made, not born. So that's a fundamental characteristic, that Frankenstein effect. It's a fundamental characteristic of how that works in sci-fi and fantasy. In the case of the alien, this is a other that we encounter, that we discover, that is already there. It is also a biological entity. So instead of being a machine, it is, like us, some sort of natural or biological being. And that calls a whole other area of social and cultural ideas into question. So in terms of machine, we're really questioning like the cognitive nature or the emotional internal nature of being human. If the machine is as intelligent in us as us, what distinguishes us from the machine? Well, biology, right? Our own mortality. In the case of aliens, we don't have that distinction. So alien tropes and the idea of the alien in science fiction is often used to explore different others. So instead of this created other, it's often used to explore things like cultural differences, social differences, differences in identity, differences in class, differences between people, and this sort of fear of the unknown or the unfamiliar, of the foreign, so to speak. And so that is what we are looking at in these three stories. As I mentioned, we're reading mostly contemporary, so rather than this alien invasion trope, we're actually looking at a different perspective on aliens, meaning how they reflect these different social, cultural, human ideas and differences as representations of the other. Now, one thing that often varies across the historical canon in the way that aliens are represented is their motivation. So there is, of course, the hostile motivation, the alien takeover, but then there's also the unknown motivation that we can be uncomfortable with. There's this sort of curious or friendly motivation. And in these stories, we see we don't really see that hostile motivation. As a matter of fact, in Ursula Le Guin, we don't even really see encounters between the alien and the non-alien, but we do see a blurring of the lines between what is human and what is considered alien. So we want to be thinking about motivation and things like that as well. Now, our first story is actually the latest in the time frame that we're working in. It's published in 2017, and that is E. Liu's The Wretched and the Beautiful. And this story is a really straightforward way to think about this idea of a cultural or identity-based difference and using the alien as a representation of the foreign in our world. So this story was actually written in direct response to Executive Order 13769, which was put a restriction on travel from certain countries of Muslim origin during the Trump administration. So it did have a very specific, cultural event in mind. However, as I mentioned, H.G. Wells, back when he was writing about War of the Worlds and Martians, had these ideas of, fear of the other, or this anxiety about the unknown and the unknown coming in. We've had these ideas all the way back, throughout the canon. So you can separate that in your mind if need be. But there's also plenty of applications to the way that the story engages with the idea of a refugee, using aliens that can apply to other things, right? There are not just political refugees, right? There's also, psychological, emotional things that people can be seeking refuge from. And the idea of empathy and our ability to connect with somebody or someone who we don't understand, or who is unfamiliar to us, or whose life, culture, and ideas are completely different from us. That is the theme and idea you want to keep in mind as you get your feet wet with aliens in E. Liu.